Hey everybody, my name is Michael, and this is Heroes and Thieves, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the world of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is a role-playing video game developed and published by Square in 1987. It's the first game in the Final Fantasy series, which many of you are familiar with already, as there are many of them out today, and I think a lot of people would call one of them in their top 5. The first Final Fantasy story follows 4 youths called the Warriors of Light, who each carry one of their world's 4 elemental crystals, which have been darkened by the 4 elemental fiends. And together, these heroes quest to defeat the evil forces, restore the light to the crystals, and save their world. The world in 1987 was a very different place than it is today. I had just turned 1 year old, and there were other RPGs out at the time competing with Final Fantasy. Some notable RPGs were Dragon Warrior, known as Dragon Quest in Japan, released in 1986. Dragon Warrior was a classic turn-based RPG developed by Enix. There was also Ultima 3, Exodus, released in 1983. Ultima 3 was a highly influential RPG developed by Richard Garriott for the Apple II computer. Wizardry existed. It was developed by Surtech. Wizardry was a series of dungeon crawling RPGs that began in 1981. Many of you should be familiar with Phantasy Star, developed by Sega. Phantasy Star was a science fiction based themed RPG released for the Sega Master System in 1987. And lastly, I just want to include Bard's Tale, developed by Interplay Productions. Bard's Tale was a dungeon crawling RPG released in 1985 for the Apple II, and later it was ported to other platforms. All of these RPGs were powerhouses, and they are still loved and played to this day. The original Final Fantasy game was developed and published by Square, now known as Square Enix, and was a landmark title in the role-playing game genre, other known as RPGs. It featured turn-based combat, an extensive world to explore, and a story that revolved around a group of heroes tasked with saving the world from darkness and destruction. Overall, Final Fantasy for the NES was a groundbreaking game that set the standard for RPGs for years to come, and helped establish the series as one of the most popular and influential in video game history. I don't think there are many people today that play video games that aren't at least familiar with one of the games in the Final Fantasy series. For the purposes of this world-building deep dive, I played through the Final Fantasy HD Pixel Remaster on Steam. Now, some of you might disagree with that choice, but it's what I had access to, and I didn't want to download an emulator, so that's what I got. Now, let's talk about some of the main features that I took away from my playthrough of Final Fantasy. I think there are 5 main world-building aspects to this world. It has towns and villages, there's a huge overworld, there are dungeons, there's magic, and there's monsters. Let's take a look at some of the towns and villages. Most of the towns and villages in this game are made up of just a single map. And on that map you'll find NPCs walking around, most of which don't have a lot to say. That's one of the main takeaways I got from this section, is that as you're talking to NPCs, a lot just talk about random things. None of them really have a specific point to share with you. Very few of them actually tell you what you're supposed to be doing, and even fewer give you hints as to where you're supposed to be going. I do find it interesting that as you go through the different towns, some of them even say the same thing. One of my favorite bits of things to do while playing this game in the towns was to interact with every single gravestone. I don't know why I had this obsession, but early in the game, you find a gravestone in a town called Elfheim, which is the city of elves. And one of the gravestones says, "Here lies Link." Very interesting to me, because Square did not have anything to do with the Zelda franchise or Link in general. To me, it jumped out as, this is Link that they're talking about. Most of the other gravestones, no, not most, all of the other gravestones just say, this is a gravestone or something like that. The actual text will be in the video you're seeing right now. Moving past the gravestones, all of the towns include some buildings and shops. Usually, there's no extra buildings than the ones you need access to. So you can't go inside any of them other than the item shop, the church place. I don't remember what it's called exactly, that you resurrect your fallen party members, the inn, the white magic shop, the black magic shop, the armor shop, and the weapon shop. Some of the cities include castles that are a separate map from the city, which you can enter directly from the overworld. These castles usually include a bunch of guards and then maybe a person of note to talk to. But outside of that, you don't get a lot of lore, you don't get a lot of information from the people there. Now let's take a look at the dungeons. There are a lot of dungeons in this game, and I enjoyed most of them. There were some of them that seemed a little too long, a little too sprawling, but that's good for some of us who like to explore. A lot of the enemies you encounter in each dungeon are specifically themed towards the dungeon. For example, in the Marsh Cave, you'll find snakes, crabs, things that poison you. By the way, Marsh Cave is the worst dungeon in the game. And I don't think this is a debate. I think, personally, there is no other dungeon that is worse than the Marsh Cave. This is the first dungeon with a considerable increase in difficulty in the game. And the reason for that is because dang near everything will poison you, and you do not have enough antidotes. And the only way to get enough antidotes to survive this dungeon would be to grind outside for a while. Luckily, in the remake, you get all of that stuff much faster, so it was easier. But in the original version, it is a nightmare because everything poisons you, and poison is one of the few status effects that does not leave upon exiting the battle. Many of the other dungeons, like I said, had enemies and monsters that were themed to the dungeon. So there were golems, earth golems, stone golems, iron golems in different dungeons. There were different variations of trolls in some of the dungeons, like ice trolls or swamp trolls, things like that. Now let's talk about the overworld. One of my favorite parts of all Final Fantasy games. When you get to be that little character on a huge map, there's just something about it that gets me excited. I like being able to explore a huge map and find cities and towns and dungeons set throughout the landscape. In this game, pretty early on, you get access to a boat, which lets you travel across the sea, which is a feeling that is so great the first time you get to it. The world really opens up to you. You get access to a canoe, which lets you go across rivers and lakes within land masses, which is also super fun. And then eventually you gain access to an airship, which at that point the world opens up to you. Because unlike the boat, there are no random encounters in the air in this game. So you can fly around the whole world without being bothered by really anything at all. You can do loops around the world, and it's a wonderful time. The world map is very interesting. There are many land masses, and I love the design and the structure of how they laid out the worlds. My favorite part of the world, I will say, is the Crescent Lake area in the bottom right of the map. And this area will find a lake that is, surprise, surprise, shaped like a crescent. And this is one of my favorite places just because of the visual interest. And there's a lot going on in that area. There's many rivers, there's mountains, there's lakes. It's got kind of all of the aspects packed into one little spot of the world. And I love it. There's also magic. Now, many of us know fantasy magic. We've seen a lot of movies, we've read books, we've played many games. I'm not saying Final Fantasy is the pioneer of magic types, but they do use them in a cool way. And throughout the history of the series, it just gets better and better, in my opinion. But there's nothing quite like the spells you'll find in Final Fantasy 1. It's some sort of like pure version of magic in RPGs. In this game, there's white magic and black magic. There's only two schools of magic, but they contain many spells that we are used to. There's fire, thunder, cure, and then you have the upgraded versions. Cura, Curaga, Thunda, Thundaga, or Thundara, Thundaga. And these spells are iconic in the series. There's also the Null line of spells, which protect you from enemy magics. So Null Shock, I think it's called. Null Thunder, Null All, that kind of thing. There's also party buff spells, which interestingly enough, your Black Mage has access to. Now these spells are called Temper and Saber, and they up the attack values of your party member that you cast it on. So with there being black and white magic, you obviously have access to black and white mages as you create your party. You can also make red mages, which I think is a very interesting thing that I love in the Final Fantasy franchise. These mages can use lower level versions of both black and white magics. So they can't have the best black spells or the best white spells, but they can have strong white and black spells and use both. For my playthrough, you'll see in the footage that's running, my party was made up of 3 warriors and 1 red mage. I did this because according to a quick Google search and Reddit finding is that some of the most common party setups are these. I didn't want an easy playthrough, but I did want one that I knew could finish the game. So I went with this setup. There were a couple bosses that I wish I had not. Mainly the big 4 fiends, which physical damage didn't do a bunch to them. And also the final boss, Chaos. Physical damage was kind of lackluster unless you spammed Saber or Temper on one of your knights, one of your warriors. And then it was fine. But to get to that point, it was grueling because these bosses hit hard. So at times I wish I had, instead of 3 warriors, I should have had 2, 1 black mage and 1 red mage. I think that would have been the actual play. Now let's get a little bit into the monsters that we find in this game. Now, as I was playing through this game, I encountered lots of just generic fantasy creatures. And I don't know a good timeline. If you've listened to our podcast, I'm not the best person to ask of who created what in fantasy lore. Who was the originator of goblins? Who created elves? Many of them were probably made from lore in the world, like real world. They weren't done by authors. They were done by people who believed these things. And we've kind of just taken them from lore and mythology and created them as enemies in games, which I think is fascinating as well, if that is true. You can let me know in the comments. What I'm about to say might be all incorrect, but feel free to educate me as well. Now, like I said, you run into goblins first thing, you fight wolves, and then as you go through the game, you fight wolves of different varieties and goblins as well. I think there's about 10, 15 different enemy types. And as you go through the game, each enemy type gets different variations. So you'll find a goblin, bigger goblin that's a different color. It's just a different recolor. And that's true for most of the enemies here. You'll find trolls, like I said before, there's different versions of trolls. You'll find ogres that have like regular ogre captain, ogre mage, and they're different colors. Some have different abilities, like the captain and mage. And as you go throughout, you'll find very similar things like that. But what I take away is that a lot of these enemies are used heavily throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. And in this first game is where they really got their grounds, a lot of these enemies. And I love them. Now let's talk about the story. And as far as the story goes, there's not a ton to talk about here, actually. Which part of me was happy for, and part of me was like, there's not a lot of story here to go over. So I'm going to summarize a little bit of the story and the main takeaways that I have for you here. There are 4 heroes that are chosen by Crystals of Light to save the world from darkness and chaos. These 4 heroes just show up one day outside of Cornelia, the first kingdom that you are starting in the game. These heroes must defeat 4 elemental fiends who have captured the Crystals of Light. These fiends are being manipulated by the evil Garland, who plans to use the crystal's power to become immortal and rule the world. These fiends you'll know as Lich, Kraken, Merilith, and Tiamat, which I love all of those, by the way. The four heroes defeat the fiends and confront Garland. Garland is then defeated, and the crystals are restored to their rightful place, bringing peace and stability back to the world. That's kind of it. That's the story of Final Fantasy. Now, as the lore goes, there's not a ton of super interesting places in the world. There is one that I liked a lot. It's called Mount Duergar. In other versions of the game, it has different names, but it's the dwarf city. It's inside of a mountain in a cave, and all the dwarves have their classic lolly-ho greeting as you talk to them. These dwarves are super helpful. They craft one of the best weapons in the game, and they open up the sea passage to a bigger portion of the world. Lastly, I just want to go over a little bit of why I think this game is so good. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit of why it might not be so good. This game served as a springboard for all of the Final Fantasies that were to come. So from here on out, you can see the influence that this game had in the rest of them. Although many of them aren't in the same universe per se. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I haven't figured that out just yet. But they do have a lot of the same world building bases to it. There's cities, there's an overworld, there's ships and transport vehicles that you get throughout the games. There's dungeons, there's monsters. A lot of the monsters are the same or similar. A lot of the magic is the same or similar or just improved upon, which I think is great. I think this game has a legacy of being the game that started a mega franchise that many people have grown to love and cherish throughout the years. Now, maybe why this game isn't ranked among people's top Final Fantasies, because there's not a lot to it. Like I said, it's a good base to build a world on, but they built the base of the world and then kind of put a game in it. They didn't expand on any of those features, but obviously it's because they went through a lot of problems in development. There was time crunch, there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of the story had changed throughout development. And I get that, but that's probably why people don't rate it as their, probably even top 5, top 10 Final Fantasy games. I've asked the question to a lot of people, what is your favorite Final Fantasy? And you probably guess it. It's 7, 9, 6, 12. Like, these are people's favorite games because those worlds are built out so well. But they took from this game, from Final Fantasy 1. It's the grandfather of greatness. And it will be a great game forever. Maybe not the best Final Fantasy, but the one that influenced the others the most. Well, there you have it. There's my quick take on the world of Final Fantasy 1. Now, I might have missed a lot. I might have included some things that probably weren't important, but you can let me know in the comments. Also, I want to know what your favorite Final Fantasy is. Mine is Final Fantasy 9. Also, I will have you know that I did begin to play through Final Fantasy Origin Stranger of Paradise. And that game is a direct spiritual sister, brother, whatever you want to call it. Maybe not retelling of the story, but a different version of the story. I'm not clear on actually what it is yet. Once I play through the game, I will do a similar video to this and examine how close actually is it. And does it improve the world of Final Fantasy 1? Or is it something completely separated? But I will tell you in the intro, it has the same exact intro text as Final Fantasy. The same world, the same map is the same. The first area, the first boss fight is the same. But after the first boss fight, it takes a real weird turn. So we'll get into that in another video. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. That's all I got. See you later.